Today is March 21st, 2022. My name is Charles Suter. Today I'm presenting the topic, How the U.S. Government Can Run Deficits Without Debts. My main message, the U.S. government can indeed run small deficits and remain debt-free. The finances of the federal government are different than individuals, households, communities, and states. The U.S. government does not have to balance its budget. In addition to its power to collect taxes to finance its operations, the U.S. government has the power to borrow by selling bonds and printing money. The U.S. government can spend more than it collects from taxes, but it must do so judiciously to avoid crowding out private investment by issuing too many treasury bonds or by printing too much money and causing inflation. This presentation explains how the U.S. government can stimulate the economy with deficit spending, again, which is spending more than it takes in from taxes, whenever the nation's productive capability falls below full employment or full production, providing the U.S. Federal Reserve purchase these U.S. government bonds rather than allowing the U.S. government bonds to be sold on the open financial markets. Proposition 1. Again, this is just a restatement of my proposition. Small U.S. government deficits can be financed without inflation. U.S. government deficit spending stimulates the economy towards full employment, full capacity. That's a good thing. As economic transactions grow because of the stimulation to the economy, so does the need for greater money supply. Herein lies the opportunity. The Federal Reserve can purchase U.S. government debt or U.S. government bonds by expanding the money supply. During periods of weak economic conditions, the U.S. government should and does step in to boost the economy towards full employment, with increases in spending or transfer payments to people who are unemployed, collectively resulting in higher aggregate spending. If the U.S. government sells bonds to private investors to finance its deficits to stimulate the economy, it would increase the nation's indebtedness. Not a good thing. Cause an increase in interest rates due to increased demand. Again, not a good thing. And reduce the private sector's spending on business opportunities. Again, not a good thing. However, the U.S. government could run small deficits without increasing its indebtedness, without increasing interest rates and inflation, and without crowding out private sector investments if, here's the big if, the Federal Reserve purchased the bonds. Proposition 2. Increases in U.S. government spending has a 3 times multiplying effect in the economy. Without going into any of the details, I'm just going to leave you with this idea. Not every dollar that's received from additional stimulus by U.S. government increased spending is spent on consumption. Some of it is saved, and that will reduce or cause the government spending to multiply by up to 3 times. Now, people with more money will spend more. Now, this will require more money for transactions. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply by buying U.S. government bonds. The bonds sold by the U.S. government to cover deficits could be bought by the Federal Reserve. Again, herein lies the opportunity. Any increase in spending from consumers, government, private investment, foreign trade adds to the demand side for goods and services, and it will trigger an increase in production capacity to meet that demand with increased supply. Normally, prices will remain relatively stable so long as the economy still has production slack and can increase production to meet the increased demand. Even if the U.S. government runs a deficit to stimulate the economy, it is best for the economic welfare of everyone if the nation's economy were operating at full employment, full capacity. An interesting side effect of greater U.S. government spending is the need for more money in circulation to support these increased transactions. And herein lies the opportunity for deficit spending without harm to the economy. The U.S. government has an opportunity to boost economic activity with small budget deficits in proportion to the expected need to grow the money supply. And they can do so without concern for overheating the economy and causing inflation, and again, only if the Federal Reserve purchases the additional government bonds. Proposition 3. The Federal Reserve will buy some or all of the U.S. government bonds. U.S. government sells the bonds to get extra funds, and the Fed buys bonds to expand the money supply. So far, so good. More money will not cause inflation so long as the economy is not at full capacity. So again, if the economy is overheated, these conditions do not apply. The government cannot operate on deficit spending because doing so will cause inflation. The Feds purchase U.S. government bonds, and how much they buy depends upon a number of factors. How fast does the money turn over in the economy? And how much do the households save of their income? Won't get into the details of this, but for academics who have that type of an interest, those are some of the caveats. The U.S. government could run deficits to stimulate the economy, at least up until economic full capacity / full employment. When the U.S. government runs a budget deficit, it must borrow or print money to pay the difference between what it spends and the tax revenue it collects. The U.S. borrows by issuing U.S. government bonds. If the government bonds were sold on the public market, it will normally increase interest rates and crowd out private investment. Again, not a good thing. However, if the nation's savings is fixed, and it usually is, then the increased U.S. government bond borrowing will normally cause an increase in interest rates paid on bonds, and there will be less funds available for private investment. Again, not a good thing. The ideal solution to U.S. government deficits is for the Federal Reserve to privately purchase the bonds directly from the U.S. government. The Federal Reserve buys U.S. government bonds by issuing bank credits to the U.S. government to cover its deficit spending. And in effect, the Federal Reserve is monetarizing the deficit by expanding the money supply. Fortunately, the deficit spending by the U.S. government and its multiplicative stimulus on the economy will require a larger money supply to enable the increase in economic transactions. The net result of the U.S. government spending more money than it takes in is to boost the economy towards full employment. That's the intent of U.S. government deficit spending. When the federal government purchases these U.S. government bonds, it becomes the creditor to the U.S. government's debts. The Treasury Department becomes the debtor, and the Federal Reserve becomes the creditor. In effect, the U.S. government borrows and lends money to itself. It's a two-sided money transaction that essentially cancels each side out. Now, my main message with the Federal Reserve, federal support, or I should say the Federal Reserve support, the U.S. government can run small deficits without inflation. I'm going to give you an example to make it clear. The ability to run consistently small deficits is possible when the government entity has the power to control its own money supply. In an expanding economy, the U.S. government could run a continuous deficit to the nation annual economic growth rate times the national income, that's the gross national product, divided by the multiplier effect. Now that sounds complicated, but here's an example. A $25 trillion economy growing at 3% a year with an income multiplier of 3 would allow nearly $250 billion a year in additional U.S. government spending. So long as the U.S. government is not tempted to exceed that limit, the economy would not become overstimulated, overheated, and the potential for economic disruption, such as increased inflation, interest rates, decreased private investment in new business opportunities, would not take place. In effect, the U.S. government can stimulate the economy without increasing debt to the nation. You may have to review this presentation a couple of times to fully absorb it, but I leave you with that thought. That's all for now. Remember to stay positive. You'll be happier, healthier, and live longer.